Hi, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you.
So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. Could you go ahead and just introduce yourself?
Sure. So, my name is Maayan Sudai. I'm a professor of law at the University of Haifa, where I teach at the law faculty and both at the Faculty of Humanities and the Gender and Women's program.
So I'd like to start by learning a little bit more about your particular area of interdisciplinary scholarship and academic work. Specifically, your work with the Gender Sci Lab and where your scholarship intersects with the current debate about transgender athlete inclusion.
Sure. So, I was actually trained in law, right? I was a law student and then my graduate studies all in law, but I always had an interest in feminism and feminist theory. My dissertation project was about the intersex rights movement and how people with that were born with unclear biological sex are fighting against medical protocols using legal strategies. So, this perspective or topic of research really had me looking at critically looking at medical protocols, medical knowledge, scientific knowledge. And so I started being involved with the history of science and women and gender studies department at Harvard, doing my dissertation at the law school. And this is how I later became involved with the Gender Sci Lab at Harvard, which is a very, cutting edge, avant garde kind of lab that incorporates really smart, brilliant people from many disciplines. Um, some are hardcore science, and some are, studies of science, whether philosophy, sociology, law. So I'm the law person there, and I'm leading the Biology and Sexual Diversity in Law and Public Policy project. This project kind of aims to identify, rising policy issues that depend on scientific knowledge and on particularly on biological claims about sex differences and gender. And that was because we see too often, many instances in which policymakers and even, justices in courts that rely on misguided reading of scientific knowledge and scientific studies and medical reports regarding sex and gender differences. And what we do at the lab are, trying to create scholarship that would facilitate a better interaction and better informed consumption of scientific knowledge and claims in law and policy making, basically.
And I think that's so important. And one of the issues that you've written about in depth that I think is so key in this current debate about transgender inclusion in sports is the definition of sex, specifically in the legal context. So, your piece on a functional analysis of sex makes a really convincing argument that basing our legal definitions of sex and gender in biology is empirically unsound. You say that there is no single biological criterion that distinguishes between males and females, and none of the recognized biological sex characteristics, chromosomes, gonads, and brain, predict any particular gender expression. So I really want to talk more about this, starting with chromosomal and genetic sex. So for people who are unfamiliar with the science on this, could you just break down how genetic and anatomical sex differentiation are less binary than we tend to think?
So, given the disclaimer that I'm not a scientist, but what I am, I'm not a biologist, I don't have this like training, but my background is actually in going really deep into understanding the biology of people with indeterminate sex. So people with, DSD, which is differences of sex development, they historically used to be called hermaphrodites. So there's a long medical history to this field of study, which talks about the middle terrain between, males and females. And there's a biological terrain, and there's, different um, ways to be on that spectrum, for bodies to be located on that spectrum, bodies that don't project the typical male and female bodies. And this is from, years of learning the medicine and biology and history of this condition is where I get my knowledge from. And what I've learned is that, while it's not the majority, and it's not very common, it's also not that rare. And we can talk about, numbers and figures later. But just to give like a very simplified overview of why some very famous and central sex characteristics are not dimorphic, I'll try to, walk you through the genetic stuff. We're used to say that males have XY chromosomes and females have XX chromosomes. And the Y chromosome is really important. We know that it's important and necessary for the development of testes, which is a strong, indication of biological maleness and creating, the hormones, the testosterone needed to masculinize a body. And so this idea that developed in the 60s and 70s was that the Y chromosome is the seat of maleness. Throughout the end of the 20th century and the 1990s, it was discovered that it's not just the Y chromosome, but a certain gene called the SRY gene that is usually found on the Y chromosome. And that gene was the gene that was considered as responsible for the development of testes. They called it like a master switch. So the existence of this SRY gene on the Y chromosome was the determining factor of whether the fetus would develop as male or female. So this was the theory that was also very popular in, in our culture. But this theory is at this point somewhat outdated, because it was discovered that recent studies in genetics discovered that it's not just that the SRY gene is responsible for the development of testes, is that it's actually working and interacting with other important genes, at least 25 other genes that are not located on the Y chromosome. These genes also influence the development of, reproductive organs such as ovaries and testes, and the anatomic or morphology of genitals. And so it was further discovered that fragments of the Y chromosome, including the SRY gene, were also found in XX females. So this is to say that the SRY gene can also appear in, you know, not on the Y chromosome. And these XX females actually developed male anatomy. I'm not going to go into the exact, different syndromes that there are, but there are many that also, regardless of the SRY um, gene, can also uh, present genetic makeup that diverts from the XXXY dimorphism. So, for example, there is XXY, or syndrome with a missing X chromosome. These conditions are usually tested prenatally, but I'm kind of trying to make the point that genes are not a clear-cut definition that determines biological sex. It's really a complex choreography between several genes that operate in a balance, and it means that biological maleness or femaleness cannot be associated with a certain chromosome or the existence of a certain gene. Now, here's how it affects genitals. Um, the genetic makeup usually determines how the gonads will develop, and gonads produce hormones. The hormones either masculinize or virilize the body. and the development of genitals. It's quite a complex process, which I'm really simplifying
Mhm.
now to you, but you can imagine that when things don't always occur the way we expect it to, it causes differences of sex development. And with regard to the question, how often does it happen? Of course, there's a dispute between, two poles of the art or of the discussion, and it really depends on how you define differences of sex development. But I can say that researchers from Brown University found that about 1.7% of all live births did not conform to the ideal of absolute sex. Which what is this absolute sex ideal? It means matching, quote unquote, gonads, chromosomes, and genitals, which means having XX with ovaries and vagina versus having an XY with testes and penises. So 1.7 of all live births sort of divert
Mhm.
from that absolute sex ideal.
Right. And also just to like build on that a little bit, some biological sex characteristics develop differently over time, right? The way that an infant appears at birth with regard to their biological sex characteristics may change, right? And may deviate from the norm as they grow in some cases.
Yeah, definitely. In the case of people with differences of sex development, puberty is a very important phase in which hormones can really change or divert the way a body is formed for everyone, I guess. But for people with DSD, it's a little less predictable. This is why, I guess, in all the medical history about hermaphrodites, what was called then hermaphrodites, you can always see this suspicion or doubt that you don't see in the modern medical practice about people with indeterminate sex. So the old doctors used to write in their case studies, you can't do, you really need to wait till puberty to see which way the body chooses to go, which was, this doubt was kind of eliminated in modernism and the modern way of practice since the 1960s. That developed just a theory and practice in which you have to assign people to a certain sex at the first 2 years of their birth through surgical assignment and hormonal medication that would support this assignment.
One of the things that you address in that article is the problem of ascribing expressions of gender, both consonant and inconsonant, to sex assigned at birth, to particular brain structure or chemistry. So, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So again, given the disclaimer, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a neuroscience and like trained and all that. So again, this idea of we have this idea or this ideal maybe that boys and girls are wired differently. This is the metaphor that's commonly used. Um, if you look at the medical history of this idea, it started with kind of experiments on rats on the 1960s, that these rats were injected with sex hormones and their behavior was observed in the lab. And what the scientists then noticed was that exposure to sex hormones during fetal development influences gender expression in areas of sexuality, cognition, temperament, mental health, etc. So this kind of ignited the theory and idea of male brains and female brains, and that exposure to sex hormones in the natal phase really influences the way gender expression. They called it brain organization, but they actually meant, gender expression, the way people behave, their interests, what they like, the toys that they prefer, the colors they prefer, and so forth and so forth. So there are, two very prominent, brilliant researchers that I want to highlight in that context. One is Dr. Rebecca Jordan Young, and the other is Dr. Daphna Joel. Both are actually coming from, different academic backgrounds and disciplines, but both kind of show in their own way the weaknesses that this theory has. Evidentiary, like evidentiary weaknesses. Did you say that? So evidentiary weaknesses and I would say empirical weaknesses of this theory. Um, I'll explain a little bit about what Joel shows. So Joel actually goes through brain scans of hundreds of people, um, and that examined. Um, um, she examined these documented differences between what was assumed to be male brains and female brains. And what she showed in her analysis was that brains that she compared did not comprise a valid scientific distinction between males and females, and that brains were vastly heterogeneous in their characteristics. And this is how she developed a new theory called the brain mosaic, showing that these distinctions between male and female brains are really hard to justify. Yeah, I don't know if that was the
No,
best
that's
explanation.
that's a very good explanation. And neurological science is like constantly evolving, right? But
Yeah, and I would also say that she's very. I mean, she's getting a lot of fire and heat over this theory, but also quite a lot of recognition, and still gets like professional recognition, but also a lot of heat and fire
yeah,
for this.
and so that piece interests me as well, because I know that some of the criticism of that particular aspect of brain science is that it is sometimes misinterpreted, or could be misinterpreted, to say that there is no biological origin to an individual's sense of themselves, and a sense that their appearance physically is not aligned with who they feel or conceive of themselves to be. But I actually don't think that that's what that. I don't think that that's what that science purports to show. But I'm interested in kind of your impressions of that. Whether you feel that one sense of gender or sex, whether that is entirely psychological, or whether there is some possibly unknown biological origin to what we think of as gender identity. And in the cases of transgender people, gender dysphoria before transition.
Right, so you're basically like asking me the nature nurture question, whether I think there's a biological origin or not. I think that there might be, but it's probably so elusive and complex, and it's comprised of like a very intricate and um, idiosyncratic interaction between these factors, that it's definitely non-predictable. And if it's not predictable, and it's somewhere along the terrain of between choice and faith. So why are we occupying ourselves so much with that
Right.
question? I have stopped asking this question long ago, and I'm just really, I have, red lights when I see people overly relying on one theory or the other. I'm always, just leaving a question mark at the end of the sentence and leaving room and for the possibility that we may never know, and also it's not maybe that important.
Yeah, and that's really the conclusion that you reach in your article, which is that sex has all of these constitutive elements. And one of those elements is gender identity, but no one element, biology, psychology, nature, nurture, is more important than the other in all situations. And when it comes to discrimination and in the context of the piece, where you consider the specific issue of discrimination against transgender students, you emphasize that the focus really should be on the nature of the discrimination and the function that sex serves in the eyes of the discriminator. I think this is incredibly thoughtful, and I really think that anyone who's interested in this issue should, explore your argument further. I'm going to link to your article in my show notes. But I would like to talk through, because in the context of your article, you're looking specifically at the exclusion of transgender students from single sex bathrooms at school. But I'd kind of like to talk through how this analysis of the function that sex serves in the eyes of the discriminator, how this would play out when we talk about the exclusion of trans and non-binary kids from single sex sports. So let's start by, if you could just walk me through your argument that anti-trans bathroom policies, like those that prohibit trans kids from using the single-sex bathroom that aligns with their gender identity, how that is discrimination on the basis of sex, regardless of what you believe sex means, not you specifically, but people out in the world.
Great. So great questions, and thank you for the nice words about this article. So as you noticed, my framework that I suggested that really tries to kind of shift away from the ontological discussion about what sex is, given that I think that the definition of sex is so contingent, as sorry, is so culturally, geographically, politically, and historically contingent. And I thought when I saw the court documents in this Green case about bathrooms, there was so much energy invested in arguing about what sex means, and I thought that was pointless. And I thought, let's shift the energy or the core of the debate into the question whether or not this sex discriminating rule makes sense or not. And I'm open to the answer that it might make sense in certain situations and conditions. Um, and so this is why I tried adopting a very inclusive understanding of sex, that it's not comprised of fixed elements, not biological, not psychological, and that it can really vary according to context. And again, just not talk about what sex is and talk about what sex does in a certain context. And so when you see a distinction based on sex, whether it's assigned sex at birth, whether it's gender identity, or anything related to that, in my framework, that satisfies the condition on the basis of sex. It's really hard to satisfy this condition in my framework, given that I want to move on to the next stage and ask whether it's justified or necessary. And given that I don't think that sex can have just like a fixed definition, or that would, I'm not sure that it would be productive in legal or in sex and gender jurisprudence. So here's how it would probably go. So in the next stage, when you say, okay, it's discriminating kind of on the basis of sex, or whatever legal doctrine you need to use, um, we need to show, or look, we'll ask, would allowing female with high testosterone levels or higher than average female testosterone levels undermine the ability to conduct a sport competition? So that would be like a functional question. And if you do apply this functional test in the narrow functional way that sex works, and I do not deny the existence of, sex, or the existence of biological differences. But honestly, if you apply the narrow technical functional test, then you would strike down a lot of discriminatory practices. Because if you think about it, what could possibly hinder, or what kind of sports females with higher testosterone levels can't do? They technically they can compete against other women, and they can compete against other males as well. But this is where kind of fairness gets into the
Mhm.
picture. And it's commonly agreed that fairness is an essential core part of sport and sport competitions. And if we can't conduct a fair competition, then if we use the BFOQ, which is the bona fide exemption, then you can't, quote unquote, do the job. If you can create, or you can't generate a fair competition, then it's really undermining the purpose, or the main um, occupation that we're trying to do here. So, but courts do interpret the BFOQ defense very narrowly, and they try to ask, whether the discriminating practice maintains important features. Um, so they often ask whether it's based or established on valid empirical facts, and not just based on what we think, stereotypes, or what is convenient for the employer. And applying this to our context, it means that you can't infer or hypothesize that females with higher testosterone levels would harm fairness. You would have to really clearly show that they have like an unfair advantage. So that's one thing, how I take the kind of questions or guidance that I want to take from the BFOQ analysis. And courts also ask or check if the discriminatory practice is the last means to achieve the goal. And applying this to our context again, you'd have to ask, is there an alternative to maintain fairness that would not go through exclusion of females with higher testosterone levels, or from competing at all? And I think that the answer for this question is also no. And so I think that the functionality test really, um, it would it would really, how to say, it would justify very limited cases of discrimination, and it would force people who discriminate to really go into the details of discrimination. Why are we doing it? What are we trying to preserve? What are we trying to protect? What evidence do we have to show? Is the risk of harm, you know really material? And all these things that we tend to assume sometimes, and we let people assume, then we would really have to justify these things. And I want this framework to kind of put most of the energy into answering these questions, and just get better informed decisions.
Yeah, and I think that the parallel that you make between the employment discrimination context and the transgender inclusion debate is really, I think, pretty clear and obvious. I mean, I definitely see the parallel. And one of the things that you point out is that, as you say, when making the assertion that discrimination in employment is justified, by, a bona fide occupational qualification, employers really need to support that with, convincing empirical evidence. And I mean, can't I can only hypothesize, but it seems that, when the Department of Education has offered these amendments to the Title IX regulations, they're kind of saying the same thing, that when they say that sex-based criteria cannot rely on overly broad generalizations without factual justification, it seems to be a similar standard. But one of the things that strikes me as being potentially problematic is that, and this is something that you have looked at in great detail, the science that is often cited to support the conclusion that higher testosterone levels definitively provide an insurmountable advantage in athletics is, really sort of deeply ingrained in our culture and our psyche, despite the fact that, as you point out in an article you published last year, this is kind of this is a misapplication of sex difference science, and it's not well settled. It is not well settled at all that, higher testosterone levels do provide such an insurmountable advantage in athletics, such that transgender inclusion cannot be fair. And, you know, I would, if you could talk a little bit more about, the science that is being invoked in this context and the problems of using that science to justify trans athlete exclusion when making sports participation policies that are quote unquote fair.
Yeah, so exactly. So sure, I wanna. I'll talk about the science that supports these exclusionary decisions gladly. But it would need for me. I would need to go back to two famous cases that happened in the last previous years of two athletes, female athletes. One is Caster Semenya and the other is Duty Chand. These were like top athletes, runners that won medals in international competitions, athletic competitions. And both of them challenged the testosterone rule, what I called in that paper the testosterone rule, which was at the time, people, females with higher testosterone levels, higher than 10 nanomoles, cannot compete in the female competitions, and that basically, excluded them from competing, and they challenged this rule in the Court of Arbitration, which we call CAS. So, what CAS asked the IAAF, which is the World Athletics governing body, was to provide sufficient, convincing empirical evidence that endogenous testosterone levels do provide a competitive advantage in sports and athletics, which they did not have at the time. At the time that the case was discussed, they had mostly cases or evidence about exogenous testosterone and how testosterone taken externally can improve athletic advantage, but not testosterone that was produced naturally. So the IAAF had 2 years to kind of find the evidence, and they initiated a big study that looked over more than 2,000 athletes in track and field competitions, and they tried proving this relationship between high testosterone levels and success, athletic performance in competitions. Now they found they divided the athletes to three groups. Tertiles with a group of testosterone levels in their blood, and they found that in 5 events, which was 400 meters running, 400 meter hurdles, 800 meters running, hammer throw, and pole vault, they found what they called to be a significant advantage to the group of female athletes with the higher testosterone levels. How significant? The margins were 2.73%, 2.78%, 1.78%, 4.53%, and 2.73%, respectively. So I'll give you a little context. The agreed gap in performance between males and females is about 10 to 12%. So that explains perhaps like a fifth, slightly more in one case. And the study concluded that this proves that females with high testosterone levels enjoy a significant competitive advantage in these events, which I repeat, just like 5 events. Now, here's the thing with science, right? Results can and often need to be interpreted. And when results don't point to a clear direction or conclusion, then interpretation and rulemaking becomes more complicated and becomes more dependent. And so the CAS decision at the time that required, the IAAF to produce evidence accepted these evidence and upheld the rule and reinstated the testosterone rule, which was made even more harsh. Instead of 10 nanomoles, it was now 5 nanomoles. So if you have like a female athlete that has above 5 nanomoles, you can't compete in the female international competitions. However, just recently, I think it was a month ago, a very important other court, which was the European Court of Human Rights, discussed the Caster Semenya case, which brought her case in this human rights court, and the chamber found that Semenya had been discriminated and that her right to privacy had been violated, and on the scientific basis, they thought that they called the scientific reliance here, or the scientific evidence, was sparse, right? That it does not, the evidence that we have do not provide the empirical validity needed to uphold this rule. And so you see how different courts arrive at different conclusions about the same evidence. In one case, it upholds a rule, in the other case, it's not enough. And so what I'm getting here is that while I do think that data and evidence and science is important, and science should be, data and evidence should be sought after. I'm not saying it's, irrelevant or out of the question or not helpful, but we also should always examine and consume them with a critical eye, interpret them very carefully, be aware of these overgeneralizations and jumping to these broad conclusions, and just take them with a grain of salt. Always be sensitive to context. I'm saying that about every consumption of scientific knowledge in law and policymaking, but specifically and very importantly in areas which are politically and culturally contested. And so I think that the fact that courts make different decisions also expose or highlight the fact that there are so many non-biological, non-scientific, non-factual considerations that also play out in this discussion very importantly. Like the other stuff that we care about, they're also part of our consideration, which is fairness and questions about inclusion, about respect to people, about opportunities, about the purpose of sports, and all these other considerations which are very important as well.
And those are the considerations that were, untested by this study. And so I think what I took away from your article and from your elaboration is that it is problematic to apply the limited scientific information that can be drawn from this one study to make policy based on the unsupported conclusion that transgender girls have a statistically significant physical advantage over cisgender girls in sports performance broadly.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I think that the science. So I talked mostly about the science about female athletes with DSD, so females with higher testosterone levels. This somewhat overlaps with questions about trans athletes, although trans athletes, like female athletes, have to be monitored. Their testosterone levels are monitored and lowered to a certain level, which also, really affects badly on their performance. Do we know how much it affects badly on their performance? I mean, there are some studies, but the study and the scientific knowledge in this area of trans sport is quite limited. I don't know of any, solid study that shows to a certain conclusion. What we usually hear is, anecdotal cases of very successful trans athletes, whether it's Leah Thomas or Laurel Hubbard. You get these names and, occasional scandals in the media about how female athletes overpower and dominate, cisgender female athletes. But I haven't seen this, again, proven scientifically in a convincing way. I'm not, closing the door on the option that it could be proven, but the way it's being um, handled now, and from the knowledge that I'm trying to gather in this topic, I don't know of any such convincing studies or any like serious um, report that shows evidence to that direction.
Yeah, and these studies on adult elite athletes, um, women who identify as cisgender women, who just biologically have higher than average testosterone levels, um, and studies on athletes generally, cisgender men and women, and their testosterone levels and their performance are invoked in court cases involving transgender girls. And I guess I'm wondering if it's fair to say that, kind of based on your research and your examination of this, that it is inappropriate really to bring that science to an analysis of what is essentially an entirely different issue.
Yeah, so it's like the politics of inferences, right? Usually you won't have a scientific study talking about exactly what you want to find, so you have to draw from other studies. And this is where, the critical margin or critical space that you have to maintain, like if you want to examine how female trans athletes perform in sports, then you would sometimes see that people go to um, studies that talk about athletic differences between males and females. So comparing biological males to um, female trans athletes, right? So that's the inference that they're making in order to make the point that people born as biological males have advantages and so forth and so forth. But that's not just inappropriate, that's just wrong, even in the like very hardcore scientific empirical way, because trans women are not biological males. Even biologically they're not that, because they have taken so much hormones that have affected how their bodies work and perform. And so it's just plainly wrong to make this um, comparison, although we often see people go into those directions. Again, and I'll add more words about females with DSD. So when Duty Chund was asked to lower her, testosterone levels in order to participate in the female competitions, she said, if I take now hormones that would reduce my natural occurring hormone testosterone levels, it would deeply impact the way my body works. And, as an athlete, as a professional elite athlete, her body is so monitored, is, you know, so well kept, is so much, she puts so much effort and work into making it work in the most optimal way. And so just imposing this um, criteria of lowering your very natural way your body works is something out of just like out of the blue, just really impacts the way that her body would perform athletically. And this is just to make the point that you know hormones do change and do impact the way the body works. And so just making these very simplified or stereotypical comparisons is yeah, it's not just inappropriate, which it is inappropriate, but it's just wrong.
So, do you think, and obviously the ethical questions of, conducting scientific studies and research on, children and adolescents is complex, but even thinking about how we can draw conclusions and extrapolate data, what type of scientific data or study would really be required to justify empirically the exclusion of trans boys and girls from school sports, scholastic sports, um, teams in a manner that, allows them to play consonant with their gender identity?
Right. So exclusion, like overall exclusion um, of trans athletes, especially in schools, I don't think that's appropriate goal in any like scenario. But I think it's a good question to try to pick my brain and ask myself, um, you know, what kind of evidence would encourage me to reconsider the way we include trans athletes in um, sport, sex segregated sports, I guess. And so, because, so if I saw this, convincing study that shows a clear and significant relationship between a certain biological factor and athletic performance, which is more than like the 2 or 3%, but something like really significant, that would make me definitely rethink the issue. But from what I'm seeing so far in the field of sports science, I don't think there's one biological factor or even two biological factors. It would be really hard to isolate the impact of just one or two factors. Like, there's hormone production, there's bone density, there's lean body mass level ratio, there's levels of hemoglobin, there's so many things that impact athletic performance, and it changes from one sport to the other. So I'm very skeptic that this kind of evidence could produce itself. However, I think that if I see, like, alternatively, if I see again a report or a study that shows again empirically convincing way that trans athletes, or I guess female athletes, like really consistently and not anecdotally dominate and overpower female athletes in a certain sport, if I would see that convincingly, uh, being happening consistently, then again, it would be worthwhile rethinking how to align, um, better align inclusivity with fairness. And I think that solutions should and can be creative, but at, anyway, they need to be respectful. And I don't I don't see myself ever justifying exclusion, total exclusion of trans athletes, nor even, you know, creating separate games for trans athletes. I also don't think I don't see myself supporting that kind of structure. What I do see me myself, what I am seeing happening in the future, I know you didn't ask me, but that's what I'm kind of contemplating upon, is that I see more and more mixed sports competitions and groups, which are usually voluntarily occurring. And I think it would be gradual, but as more and more people would participate in these mixed sex sport spaces, we would learn a lot from that experience. And I hope that it would bring to more integration, not just between like trans and cis, but also between males and females. And while I do know and recognize the value of, marginal collective communities, spaces for sports, to do their own. So it is important for women and for girls and for trans to have their own like spaces to do sport within their own group. It's also important and maybe worth encouraging the creation of more mixed spaces for sport, for just doing sport and competing in sports. And this is where I hope it would go towards.
Yeah, and you're one of many people I've spoken to who see that sort of a as the future, right, of particularly participation sports, right? That um, perhaps where we need to go is to a place where, as a society, if what we care about are the sort of basic benefits, the fundamental benefits of participation in sports, that separation by sex, however you define sex, is really unimportant. So I think that that's a really great place to end. Thank you so much. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate, especially at this time in your life, you making this the time to talk to me.